Welcome to another edition of Geopolitics and Empire. A quick reminder to support the Rebel transmission. It's very important. Free way to do that is leaving a review on Apple, Spotify, sharing the podcast, subscribing to all my channels. And I do need your financial support. Otherwise, at some point, I'm going to stop doing this. The best way to do that is becoming a paid subscriber on Geopolitics and Empire Substack, $5 a month or more if you like, $50 a year. You can buy me a coffee. Donor box is functioning. Subscribestar. Ko-fi, K-O-F-I. I just opened that, so you can use that as well. You can purchase a consult to chat with me, and do check out my affiliates like Legal Shield, which is great if you're in America or Canada, Wise Wolf Gold, Above Phone, and so forth. Returning to the Rebel transmission is Joe Allen, author of the awesome book Dark Aeon, Transhumanism and the War Against Humanity, which we discussed previously. Welcome back, Joe.
Very good to be here. Thank you very much.
I see that the AI Slaughterbot killer drone swarm still has not taken you out. How's life?
Yeah, not yet. That's mainly because I'm hidden in a bunker deep beneath the earth, and I stay here. So, and I'm worried though that they're going to send robot dogs with machine guns after me. It's great. Watching all of this unfold. I'm not a doomer really. I'm a very particular doomer. I believe that doom will be spread unevenly. So as this technological system develops, there'll be many who take advantage of it and get very, very rich, but not as many as those who are subjugated by it and made, or just simply subject to it. And, there'll be plenty that are made irrelevant and just kind of wiped out, perhaps, especially as the drone warfare and other means of eradicating humans become more sophisticated. But, it'll be an uneven playing field. And I think that also there'll be plenty of people who, just like in ages past, were spared by the predominant systems. I'm certain of that. But watching this progress, I do get a real sense of fatalism that everything emanating out of Silicon Valley and the Pentagon and other nations and their counterparts, that train is rolling fast. I don't see it stopping.
I agree with you on all those points, including the uneven dystopia. I mean, just one of the recent reports from Biometric Update that in Japan, their digital IDs are already being hacked. So there are, black market criminal groups already messing with that. So it's going to be a totally uneven rollout of the dystopia. And I guess we want to see how many people we can trigger with this episode. You wanted to touch on some occult, Gnostic, and esoteric stuff. By the way, I saw you saw me post about World Invocation Day, which was just a couple days ago, May 24th. Joe, did you invoke the Antichrist?
I did not. I do everything I can to dispel and banish the Antichrist and the spirit of Antichrist. Although every time I log onto my computer, I realize that perhaps these banishments are kind of futile if I'm just going to digitize my soul in the Antichrist realm. That's partly hyperbolic and sarcastic, only partly though.
Yeah, I mean, it was wild that, again, you can't make this stuff up. Lucis Trust, the UN, NGO, literally talking about invoking the coming one, Lucifer the Christ, according to their own theology, and which would in other traditions be the Antichrist. But, a lot of people got triggered with my discussion with David Gosselin not long ago. I like his work. And again, I have people from all walks on the podcast, and I like to learn from everyone. And so you've got some thoughts on all this discussion that's going on regarding Gnosticism and so forth. So what do you make of it?
Well, my book, the title of my book, Dark Aeon or Aeon, depending on how you want to pronounce it. Dark Aeon is really a nod to Gnosticism. The Gnostics that I know personally tend to say Aeon in regard to the divine beings. And so maybe in regard to Gnosticism, as opposed to a period of time, Aeon is more, appropriate. Eon may be more appropriate for the dual meaning of period of time. So something that I've noted, I'm good friends with Courtney Turner and her fiance. We've discussed this a lot. I don't know if I've swayed them. Courtney and I met and argued immediately, and so we've become fast friends because we both like to argue. I don't know how much I've swayed her. She has swayed me to some extent. She certainly opened my eyes to a lot of different organizations I wasn't aware of. But the notion that behind all of our woes are a group of Gnostics or a group of Esotericists who are invoking demons and unleashing them on the world, perhaps. I think that some of my favorite authors take that hyper-paranoid stance. Philip K. Dick, just an extraordinarily paranoid mentality, and yet quite beautiful. And I also think just not only the prescience of his work, but that sort of sinister, paranoid schema that he's working from or was working from, that it is appropriate for certain elements of the world as it is today and the world to come. There are many other examples. You're probably familiar with Joseph P. Farrell, the host of Giza Death Star, and he had a wonderful book on alchemy and transhumanism. I think it was something to the effect of transhumanism, a grimoire of alchemical transformation. I probably shouldn't have even attempted to remember the title. It's been years since I've read it, but he is, I think, very much in that genre. A very intelligent, very excellent researcher who is also extremely paranoid and tends to paint with a very broad brush. Another example, I'll just bring in one more, is Transhumanism, A History of a Dangerous Idea. That was written by David Livingston. And it is also a wonderful book, but it's probably the most distilled paranoia that you can read in one sitting. It's a very breezy read. I read it very, very quickly. But he, kind of like others, William Cooper and people like that, he basically portrays the current situation, transhumanism, as an outgrowth of esoteric groups going back to Babylon and before, and that everything that we're seeing is the result of a kind of illuminated Neo-Babylonian conspiracy. And most of what we see in the public are engineered rituals and things like this. And it basically, all of these perspectives kind of hinge on this idea that everything is bad and evil. Like, it's very difficult to find where the good stuff is in any of it. Very few of these authors have any kind of firm ground that they're standing on. In the case of Livingston, I'm not familiar with his actual religious belief, but he opens with a Muslim passage in the book, A History of a Dangerous Idea, Transhumanism. And maybe he's working from that premise. And if you're a Muslim, as you look at the dominance of the West, it's pretty easy to find evil in everything. Or perhaps in the case of Philip K. Dick, he took solace in a kind of Gnostic perspective that, perhaps the higher beings, the pleroma, were in fact benevolent, but everything else in our world is the product of an irrational God. I think that it's a very valuable perspective, but it's not one that I work from. And the more this takes hold, the more it becomes popular, the more you see the kind of alliances between Alex Jones, Andrew Tate, and Nick Fuentes, the more that point of view is going to infect not only the culture as a whole, but also the politics. It already has. And I would, as much as my tiny little voice makes a difference, I would like to at least clarify a few things if we could.
Yeah, just regarding Philip Dick, I finally had time. He wrote the novel, I think, Man in the High Castle, and I finally finished watching the show. I never got to finish the 4th season, but after leaving TNT Radio, I finally got through it. I absolutely loved it. I think I did contact David Livingston once about an interview. We never followed through, but my worldview is, I can't shake that there is some sort of occult Gnostic esoteric thing going on. Again, that's emanating from my Christian worldview, and ultimately it's Lucifer. But then I don't know to what extent. I'm not as well versed on that stuff, but I do continue to be surprised. The most recent example was, I like the work that Amazing Polly has done, and she recently shared something that she agreed with this guy called Israel Anderson. And it really sort of, I got unhappy with it because he's very slick, his production, he's very convincing, but he's basically saying, I kind of have an issue with people who seem to say two different things at once, or that seem disingenuous. For Israel Anderson is saying basically Yahweh God is Satan. Oh, I'm not a Gnostic. But for me, it's just repackaged Gnosticism. And so I feel there's just a lot of deception in that area. But your further thoughts and where do you work from?
Well, in regard to, I'm not familiar with Israel Anderson. This is the first I've ever heard of his name, but I'm very much opposed to, or at least I bristle at the use of Gnosticism as a blanket term for pretty much anything you don't like. It becomes kind of like racism, that you see it, anywhere. Once you've seen it once, you start to see it everywhere, and suddenly everyone is racist, and the word loses all meaning. But in the case of what you just described, God is Satan, there may be, who knows exactly, I don't know how he approaches it, but that notion is deeply rooted in Gnostic thought, although there is a lot more nuance to it than that. It is deeply rooted in Gnostic thought. You look at a guy like David Icke. He is, I think, I don't know if he's ever overtly claimed to be a Gnostic, but he speaks frequently of Archons. He fits the kind of paranoid psychological profile that everything is evil, except for him, the inner light, the goodness of oneself. Although listening to David Icke, it's very difficult to find the light even within him. He's pretty bleak. Maybe people would say the same of me. I guess if as long as we're confessing, my own orientation is Christian, and but it's very heterodox Christianity, which is not very popular with my Orthodox or Catholic friends, or even my Baptist friends, what few remain my friends. I don't, it's not that I think the world should consist of heterodox Christians. I just simply have never been able to find a home in any kind of Orthodox tradition, be it Catholic, Eastern Orthodoxy, or any form of like mainline Protestant religion, or Orthodox Judaism, or any of that. So, but at the heart of it, to me, I spent my education, academic education, is in comparative religion. My concentration was in New Testament studies, especially the Gospel, and to me, the hinge of the gospel, the axis of the gospel is the Sermon on the Mount and its counterpart in the Sermon on the Plain. And it is a very world-denying or ascetic point of view. The values of the world, everything from the acquisition of wealth and power to sexual conquest, are by and large rejected in those teachings, and you find counterparts across the world in other religious traditions, but it's very corny in my mind to adopt foreign religions, so I would not consider myself to be some kind of Buddhist Christian or anything like that. But I think that the gentleness at the center of the Sermon on the Mount and the Sermon on the Plain, and it's the fruition of that gentleness in the crucifixion, that is the central point of Christianity to me. That puts me at odds with many of my Christian, more Orthodox friends, but that's where I'm coming from. I think it's much more difficult to follow the instruction of the Sermon on the Mount and Sermon on the Plain than it is to go to church, take Eucharist, and still enjoy all of the sorts of powers and privileges of the worldly institutions. But I don't condemn it. Again, I'm not a Gnostic. So real quick, if I could just make a couple of different distinctions. The first, between the esoteric and the exoteric, and between mainline or acceptable religion and Orthodox religion and heresy. So that the esoteric and the exoteric, I think, could be applied very broadly. Those are terms that are, I think, intended for broad application. So that the exoteric is that the institutional practices and teachings that the larger flock, the laity, are instructed in. And then, and the laity will, of course, have freedom in any sort of religious community to increase their knowledge and to move up in the grades, so to speak, towards more and more esoteric knowledge. But in the beginning, the simple things are most appropriate. And so the exoteric tradition is what we see. That's what we see in the churches. That's what we see in public proclamations. The esoteric, to the extent that it is embraced at all in any religious system, is just simply that which is hidden from public eye, that which is inner, that which is in some cases secret, or at the very least not spoken of outwardly. And it varies from tradition to tradition. In the Protestant tradition, for instance, there's this radical transparency. In the Catholic tradition and the Orthodox tradition, I would argue that there is a bit more of the kind of esoteric element, although it's not intended to necessarily be hidden. It's just simply not spoken of because of its sacredness and because of the ease with which the wider world would profane it. In the world of the internet, of course, that all gets blown apart. All of what we once considered esoteric has become profoundly exoteric. Any jerk with a computer can, in enough time on his hands, can Google up pretty much any esoteric tradition that was ever put down on paper and uploaded into the large surveillance panopticon that we call the internet. So that distinction is really important. And so then when you start talking, though, about heresies versus the Orthodox, it's kind of a different thing, because what many would consider to be heretical beliefs have both the esoteric and exoteric elements. The Gnostics were very much an esoteric sort of group. It's very difficult to talk about the Gnostics as a group. There were a lot of different groups that were either labeled Gnostics or were self-identified as Gnostics, and they all differ with each other quite a bit. Just to name three examples, you had Valentinus in the 2nd century, and also Marcion, and both of them were fairly different in their approach to Gnosticism. There are many who would argue that Marcion wasn't even a Gnostic, really. He was just simply a kind of radical Christian who excluded the Old Testament and various elements of the New Testament. And then you had the 3rd century teacher, Mani, who was quite different in flavor and in his approach to Gnosticism or gnosis. He was operating out of the East. He traveled widely in the East, all the way into Asia, from, I believe, beginning in Persia, but certainly within Persia. And his teaching, you could see kind of the way in which his version of Gnosticism, while still retaining the Christian elements, was very informed by Zoroastrianism. Ironically, he was killed by Zoroastrians for being a heretic. But so I guess those distinctions between the esoteric and the exoteric, between the Orthodox and heresy, and then between Gnosticism and heresy, right? Because heresies go all over the place. There are all sorts of charismatic movements and ideas about the unity or disunity of the Trinity, all of which fall under the category of heresy. But Gnosticism was a very specific type of heresy. And even within that one category, you have a lot of different subcategories. You have now with the unearthing of the Nag Hammadi library in 1945, you really can appreciate the wide diversity of Gnostics and Gnosticism. And again, I'm not a Gnostic. I don't, for me, I think that having faith is essential, because for Gnostics, the ultimate evil, this is not all Gnostics, but by and large, for Gnostics, the ultimate evil is ignorance. And so hence the opposite side of that is gnosis, the special knowledge or the direct experience. The gnosis is the way in which the inner soul touches the ultimate good, and ignorance is that trap within which we are imprisoned. And so this idea of knowledge versus ignorance, you find it also in the Hindu traditions, you find it also in the Buddhist traditions. And I think for me, yes, of course, even mainline Christians will acknowledge that we all have an experience of God in various ways, most of the time very obscure, but occasionally even, accepted saints speak of direct experience of Christ. Paul, his conversion, hinged on a direct experience of Christ. And so that, I think, is valid. But to put ultimate faith in that gnosis, I myself, I guess I see the world as being far greater than my mere brain or the soul housed within that brain will be able to comprehend in this life. And so I think faith is a much more important element in the Christian path, because it acknowledges first and foremost our kind of inherent ignorance. And while it's not to valorize ignorance, but it certainly accepts there's a certain fatalism there that accepts that ignorance is kind of the lot of human beings. So did any of that make sense? Please correct me on my meandering path, and we'll delve further into all aeons, dark and light.
Yeah, I also, I let people know where I'm coming from, a Christian worldview, and that's what I believe. I'm not going to be changed from that, but I also accept, there are limits. I don't know everything. There are many limits to knowing what's going on, whether it's biblical or just what's happening in the world, and some of the things you mentioned. Again, referring to some of the conspiracists, the conspiracy folk, the old media crowd, they often, their attitude is one of like this Gnostic elitism, where they speak down condescendingly, and I'll get comments that say, some people have called me ignorant, and I'm like, I never call anyone who doesn't agree with me ignorant, so the way they talk, and it's often like, I'm sorry, but I've pointed out that I view that a lot of these people in alt media falling into these certain patterns of belief, like no virus, are often the case, if not, they look into Rudolf Steiner. They talk about flat Earth, because I think Steiner talked about that. And they openly talk about New Age. And so I just kind of see that trend there. But, there's that. And then what, how do we make sense of what's going on? Because, you do have we've mentioned Lutz's Trust. There's a lot of talk now about theosophy, right? Blavatsky, that stuff's coming back. And then you've got, United Nations, everyone talks about SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. There's something called the Inner Development Goals, again, which is sort of seeming to overlap with some of this stuff. But, to your point, I would say it's, there are different groups of Gnostics. They don't all agree. Maybe it comes and goes throughout history, like a cycle in terms of their importance or on the scene. So, your further thoughts.
The generic frameworks were very helpful in studying different religions. If you just stop there, then it doesn't really, it leaves you at a point where you're just kind of hanging on a branch that's ready to fall out from underneath you. But certain distinctions, such as iconic versus aniconic religions, so Judaism and Islam, by and large, being aniconic, God is not to be put forward in any kind of visual imagery, versus iconic religions, Catholicism being very iconic. Christ is God. Christ is in your face as a visual representation. The Hindus obviously are not at all shy about their making statues and images and paintings of their oftentimes jokingly said 330 million gods, to which, depending on the school of thought, all of them are kind of faces of the one God, but without getting, and then you have notions of polytheism versus monotheism, pantheism, panentheism, so on and so forth, atheism, which is very old. And so the kind of generic framework, I think, does at least give you an inroad into making sense. If you can find general patterns in all of this diversity, you can begin to kind of make sense of it. And so I think that the kind of Gnostic little g versus Gnostic big G, Courtney Turner and I in our first interview together discussed this, and it's in my book. I don't refer to it, I don't believe, as little g, big G, but she was the one who, as far as I'm concerned, she coined it. She was the one who brought that into our conversations. But Gnosticism, big G, being the specific Gnostics, the traditions that preceded Christianity in Judaism and arguably in the Greek, Platonic, and Neoplatonic traditions, the idea that an inner knowledge and inner experience is in fact the primary access point to the divine. The specific big G Gnostics versus kind of little G Gnosticism, just simply traditions that place that dichotomy between faith and unbelief versus those that place the dichotomy as knowledge versus ignorance, the latter being Gnostic little g. So what I see in Gnosticism little g, if you look at Gnosticism big G, what is it? It's a story that is a kind of inversion of the Orthodox Christian story of the creation, in which basically the fall of man is pushed back to the divine realm, not in the actual specifics of Adam and Eve. It begins very much in a kind of, depending on the text, in a kind of Neoplatonic conception of an unseen father, that begins to emanate out into the various aeons, these divine male-female pairs that are in essence divinities and emanations of that one unseen father. Depending on the tradition, you get to the outer ring, the male-female pair, the female turns away from the hierarchy of light towards the darkness, is lured into the outer darkness or the material. It gives birth after, depending on, again, on the story, gives birth after contact with the kind of malevolent entities that inexplicably just exist out there. She gives birth. This is Sophia, by the way. This is Sophia, the female counterpart of the outermost hierarchy. And Sophia gives birth to a blind or a half-blind god, Yaldabaoth, or also Samael, and then, of course, in some interpretations, Yahweh. Out there in the outer darkness, this Yaldabaoth or Samael believes that he is the only entity in all of creation, and in both his arrogance and kind of loneliness, he begins to create the world. It is because of his ignorance of the higher divine hierarchy. He creates a very imperfect world, and he's constantly demanding that the world obey his dictates, and the world continues to rebel because it's imperfect, the creation. And situated in all that is this idea that Sophia imbued humankind, again, kind of inexplicably, humankind, Adam and Eve, with the inner light, the inner divinity from the higher aeons, from the higher hierarchy. And, in a quite sinister fashion to any Orthodox Christian, you have the serpent then tempts or offers the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil to Adam and Eve. And this is the first gnosis, in a sense, right? This is the first introduction into this imperfect, blind God's creation of the knowledge that there is a higher world that can provide escape from the travails of the material. Now, that's Gnosticism big G, right? And in that hierarchy, by the way, in the whole of the creation, you look at the planets, and even in some traditions, the stars, these are archons. In the Greek, it just simply means a petty ruler. And these archons are in what the Christians would call demons, right? So that the planets and astrology and all the fates, they're ruled by demons. And gnosis is the quest to get out of this material prison into something higher, into the pleroma, the divine fullness. So it's a very paranoid point of view from the perspective of the believer. You realize that not only have the institutions that surround you, let's say the Orthodox Church, that they are predicated by and large on an incomplete or ignorant version of the real truth. And that the material, the most basic things, the animals, the plants, natural processes, what goodness is in them is just a pale reflection of the true goodness, and what evil is in them is kind of the essence of the nature of the material. And so you're looking around, you see a beautiful sunset, you see birds flying around, you hear them sing, you look at a beautiful woman, you see, a beautiful structure, a building, a church, a government, whatever. And at the heart of all of it is this kind of paranoid sense that it is at best incomplete, and at worst the product of actual malevolent entities. And that goes all the way up to the heavens and to the planets themselves, who are trapping human souls and bringing them back into the material prison. Profoundly paranoid and profoundly alienated, right? Profoundly lonely. that those Gnostics or this small community who find themselves kind of on an island of otherwise kind of zombie-like automatons, right? And that paranoia, if you just extract that as just a general feature of Gnosticism, and I think it cheapens real Gnosticism to do so, but we'll do it for sake of argument, that to extract that paranoia, the world is a prison. People are, you have this tiny elite group that are, pneumatics. They're spiritually enlightened, and then you have the lower level that are a little bit better, the Christians who are psychics, they're better than the worst of the worst, but they're still pretty ignorant. And then the vast masses, they're the hylics, the material. They're just basically, they're worse than animals. They're soulless, right? Depending on the teaching. So there's an elitism, a loneliness, a paranoia. Yes, I would say, and this is an argument that I made to Courtney Turner, and she found it amusing if she was somewhat nonplussed too, but the conspiracy culture, the entirety of conspiracy culture, whether it's the CIA or the Illuminati or the Masons or some secret Muslim cabal or the communists or the Gnostics or whatever, that it really is probably the most distilled realization of that kind of generic paranoid little g Gnostic point of view. You have realized that all these institutions are corrupted by this conspiracy, and that everything is controlled by the secret group of Archons, right? David Icke speaks of it openly. Most it's just kind of it's subtle, it's implicit. But that paranoid point of view, there's really only one way out, right? And that's the secret knowledge, the knowledge that's forbidden to all. The CIA is actually doing it all, or the Vatican is actually doing it all, or maybe some secret group of high IQ Africans that is manipulating all of it. The Neo-Babylonian death cult. Somewhere in each one of those is this seed, this kernel, that the higher gnosis, the higher knowledge of the conspiracy is the exit point from the matrix and the entry point to some sort of freedom. Now, at least the Gnostic Big G says that, once you've escaped this material prison, you have this infinite sort of divine realm into the ultimate light that you can go to. But by and large, the conspiracy theorist is kind of left floundering. Either they can, write books about it and sell them, or they may be able to launch some sort of political movement on the basis of it. But they're, in many ways as helpless and as alienated as the Gnostic Big G Gnostics found themselves. And so the little G Gnostic conspiracy theorists, it's quite ironic, especially when they are pointing the accusing finger at the big G Gnostics, who by and large don't even exist at this point in history. It's ironic. It's funny. To me, that may be the greatest liberty of all that we can find in all of this darkness, is that it's very ironic and oftentimes very funny, especially if you're not the one getting assassinated or imprisoned. But so that's kind of what I see in conspiracy culture is like this it's a double-edged sword. On the one hand, you have this hyper-skepticism and this obsession with research that unearths all of these really useful facts about the world. And that goes back to, you could argue that like the earliest conspiracy theorists were like the anti-monarchists, or maybe the earliest conspiracy theorists were the Gnostics, or maybe the earliest conspiracy theorists were the Hebrews, who saw the various empires of earth as being these flawed polytheistic kind of works of lesser or non-existent gods. But that skepticism is really, really important, because I think that the mainstream is by and large pretty dopey. It's made to make you, it's made to make you think half thoughts and to never really follow through on them, and to just kind of muddle through life with some sense of unease at the evil, but some sense of contentment or satisfaction that someone's fighting that evil. Whereas this like paranoid, hyper skeptical, hyper obsessive point of view, the Joseph Farrells, the David Ickes, the Francis E. Dex, probably my favorite little G Gnostic, whose works I detail in my book. But it's on the one hand very useful, and on the other hand, it's profoundly unhealthy. And I've been obsessed with conspiracy since I was a teenager, and to date myself, we're talking about the mid to late 90s. So when 9/11 happened, I was pretty primed for it, and I have drawn that poison out of the system and injected my brain with it continuously for decades. And I in some ways, it's helpful. Again, there are many facts about the world that conspiracy theorists are unearthing that are, I think, of much value. If nothing else, the ambiguity of official stories, be it JFK, 9/11, World War II, whatever, Civil War, whatever. But in the end, just seeing it on the ground, studying religion, what I look at more often than not are the people. Like, I go to the different communities, or I used to when that was still what I did. But this is a personal evaluation. But what kind of people does this tradition produce? Does the tradition produce charitable people, productive people, happy families, healthy people, or does it produce some sort of weird, aberrant kind of human? And without a doubt, almost entirely, the kind of Gnostic little g, but this sort of paranoid conspiratorial mindset that everything is a lie. And only this like small few people have the secret knowledge of what's really going on. It's so isolating, self-isolating, self-alienating. And, the inner defense mechanisms are always being primed so that you feel this kind of sense of aggression towards the outer world. It turns people into freaking whack jobs and kooks who oftentimes end up in the basement if they're lucky, or in the ghetto if they're not, and with profoundly broken personal lives. And they can be oftentimes very unbearable to be around in person because of it. I say this both in a kind of condemnation, but also an admission. Many times in my life, I've embodied that kind of personality. So I don't want to get too high and mighty on all of this, but I do think that in the final analysis, that whatever benefits there are to this hyper-skepticism of the mainstream narratives and obsessive unearthing of secret knowledge and secret facts, that if it just turns you into a fucking, I don't think I can say, if it just turns you into, if it just turns you into a fucking loser, then it doesn't really matter. And if you end up getting yourself killed like William Cooper, then it really doesn't matter. Now, the little G Gnostics would say that the state had William Cooper killed. And that's quite possible. I wouldn't argue necessarily against it. But it's also quite possible that William Cooper's hyper-paranoid, aggressive personality and propensity to wave guns around got him killed. So it's an important thing to look at. And to all the healthy, well-adjusted conspiracy theorists and little G Gnostics out there, I do understand there are exceptions to the rules. And I look forward to having tea with you in the future.
I think what you're bringing up is so important right now, and something that I've been thinking about. And like you say, I've been guilty of that, some 5-10 years ago, where I'd be the annoying uncle, the annoying guy at the party, not shutting up about 9/11 and stuff. And you realize it's not healthy. It's not going to help you in any way. Right? You're not, like you say, you're not going to be productive. You're not going to get a girlfriend that way, so on and so forth. And there was this meme that I came across that I shared recently, and it's got like 4 Russian Matryoshka dolls, but they're painted with like the Mexican, skull. And the biggest one says Freemasonry, and it goes down the line: Freemasonry, Theosophical Society, New Age movement, Truth movement, and there are a number of things here. I do want to ask you, but it's like, I find a lot of these people in the truth movement or conspiracy culture, there's a lot of narcissism and ego. They're like, I'm so smart. I've reached the gnosis. I mean, even someone today, I posted on my feed, I'm trying to post what I think is the most interesting news of the day. I post Telegraph talking about Israeli airstrike melting the tents and children in Rafah. And one of my followers says, and this person is consistently like this, is, You're way late on this. See this and this, and it's just like people like, I'm smarter. I found it before you. I'm just like,
yeah. First,
come on, man. Like, really, I don't have time. I'm not about that. That's not what it should be about. We're having this dialogue. We're trying to come to conclusions to figure out what is happening in the world. It's not about that. But could you say that this alternative media conspiracy culture itself is almost like a branch now of Gnosticism?
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, like I say, Gnostic little g, it is. But I know personally a number of people who are involved in the kind of Gnostic big G revival movement, and they really run the gamut. Some of them, those that I'm close to, are in fact quite well-adjusted, quite charitable, very good-natured people. They're not perfect. They're not saints. Their gnosis has not burned away all of their human flaws. Sorry, guys, but they haven't. It hasn't. But what I do find is, again, like, what kind of person does this produce? What kind of life? What kind of decisions? What kind of families? Many of them are, as you would kind of imagine, unorthodox. They're not in the little u, in the sense that they tend to be kind of weird people, right? I love weird people, though, but they are, by and large, well-adjusted weird people. Now, there are other elements. This, by the way, the community I'm talking about centers around the Ecclesia Gnostica in L.A., in Los Angeles. And this was really the work of Stephan Heller. And Stephan Heller is a really interesting person. Right now you hear a lot of stuff about how Marxism is just Gnosticism, and transhumanism is just Gnosticism, so on and so forth. But at least the actual center of the Gnostic revival movement, which there are many of them, but this is probably the most elaborate and I think the most informed in regard to the actual ancient tradition of Gnosticism. Stephan Heller is a huge Trump supporter. He's very old now. He'll probably pass in not too short a time. He's in his 90s. But he was just a ferocious opponent to totalitarianism of all forms, to communism, to fascism. He was a very exultant proponent of America and the quest for freedom from monarchy, freedom from the kind of 20th century technological, scientific, totalitarian movements of fascism and eugenics, or communism and economic centralization. And his biography is very interesting in regard to that, because he's Hungarian. And, some of his earliest memories were the Nazis invading and occupying Hungary. And then, of course, the communists, after the Nazis are ousted, the communists are the ruling party of Hungary. And he witnessed his uncle being killed by communist thugs. And so his opposition to these totalitarian, hyper-materialistic, biologically obsessed ideologies, and his adherence to the liberatory spirit of America, and to him, the liberatory spirit of Christianity, really, it just doesn't fit with this kind of generic, communism is just Gnosticism, or woke is just Gnosticism, or transhumanism is just Gnosticism. And he is not, like, in regard to technology, he's very much a man of his era, right? Kind of greatest generation / boomer sort of era. He still uses a landline and is not on the phone very much, and he's always been averse. If you read his writings, he's very averse to the narcissism and the kind of materialist gratification of digital culture. He was writing mostly about early internet culture. That was when he was most active and prolific. But he made a clear distinction there, and he really wasn't a fan of Philip K. Dick's sort of postmodernist creative science fiction spin or twist on Gnosticism. He thought that it was too obsessed with the technological. For Stephan Heller, gnosis is very much spiritual, inward, and the material, the outward, is just inherently flawed. Typical gnosis. Whereas for Philip K. Dick, it's just very schizophrenic, and is the pink beam of gnosis hitting him in the forehead, is that God himself or itself? Or is it an alien? Is it the vast active living intelligence system, sort of computer doing it, right? Heller does not embody any of those things. And if there's one clear distinction Heller made, it's that distinction between what he kind of categorizes as the Latin scientia, the root of science, the knowledge of the facts of the material world and those theories that unify that knowledge, and gnosis, in its purest form, an inner, at least transcendent of the material, or maybe anti-material realization. And so these kind of, this is the argument I make in the 10th chapter of my book, Virtual Gnosis. And it was in many ways the inspiration, in looking at transhumanism. Obviously, I object to the ultimate goals and aims of transhumanism, but I think that the conflation of transhumanism with Gnosticism is cheap and wrongheaded. If I'm going to be kind of confessional, I think that my early coverage of transhumanism in the way, as we were in the intensity of the pandemic and the kind of accusatory and aggressive tone that I had, was in fact, more the product of my own revulsion towards the regime that was being pushed down upon us than it was necessarily to transhumanism itself. As I worked through the writing of this book, and as I met and spoke to transhumanists, I don't like them all by any means, but the more I understood the kind of complexity of their thought and the distinctions between just technophilia, transhumanism, posthumanism, all that, the more I realized that the isms, these broad brush isms, are very useful politically. They're very good training wheels for people intellectually. But in the end, the isms are, how shall I put it, demiurgic in their character. They are, they seek to, they ultimately limit your ability to think. And you might say, well, Joe, you name your book Transhumanism? So, yeah, okay. Well, you gotta find a bridge. But this is a long way of saying, I think that the cheap use of isms, be it fascism, communism, racism, or Gnosticism, I get it's very useful on the exoteric level for moving public policy, so on and so forth. But increasingly, I am just very annoyed by it and perhaps a bit derisive of it. I think that it's just a shallow way of thinking and oftentimes a very damaging way of moving the culture.
Yeah, and just one example, I think, to the problem of the cartoonishness of the alt media, where they try to just make so many things black and white. And I'm just using a recent example. Matthew Crawford, I chatted with him, a lot of talk about controlled opposition and whatnot. And it's like, you see all this stuff about this person or that person is a controlled opposition. It's just like, look, I've never met the person. I'm not going to spend my entire week now researching their life and I can't say this or that. And it's just kind of that idea of what you're saying, creating this umbrella term. So would you say then it's not like you're not necessarily making a defense of Gnosticism? You're saying we should apply it more carefully, and so not everything or everyone is necessarily agnostic. And then as you say, if you actually meet some of these people in Silicon Valley, yes, I'm sure there are open Gnostics and whatnot, but there are others that maybe you thought were Gnostic, but they're actually not. Like, there's more nuance.
Absolutely. I mean, in the revivalist movement of the 20th and 21st century, it goes all over the place. Absolutely. Like Silicon Valley, you have a lot of people who find a lot of inspiration in the Gnostic teachings. Eric Schmidt references it in his book, The Age of AI. That was really interesting to me. And the more I get to see how Eric Schmidt thinks, the more he kind of reveals of his kind of woo-woo quantum physics infused philosophy, if you want to call it that, or at least viewpoint, worldview. So that's just one point. But there are a number of people, like, for instance, I have spent a fair amount of time looking at the effective accelerationist movement, and there are a number of individuals within the effective accelerationist movement, or EAC, who just directly reference Gnostic texts, Gnostic teachings, Hermetic texts, Hermetic teachings as being inspirational for their quest to create superintelligent AI, and transcend the bounds of the limited human mind. But as I point out in the book, and as from the perspective of the Ecclesia Gnostica in LA, or at least many of the people there, and certainly of Heller, and the kind of Neoplatonist tradition as a whole, because Gnosticism, you could say, is if you wanted to get real cheap about throwing isms around, you could say that Gnosticism is just Christianity plus Neoplatonism, or you could say it's Neoplatonism wearing a Christian skin suit. But the connection is very direct, and the idea that there is a world of ideals, a world of forms that has kind of condensed into matter, into the material expressions of it that you see now: the tree, the river, the squirrel, you. That is really at the root of the kind of generic Gnostic big G point of view, is that there are these higher realms, and it takes in many ways Neoplatonic ideas and applies them to Jesus, the figure of Jesus, or vice versa. So from the perspective of the ecclesia, these technologies, or the kind of big G Gnostics, and really in my own view, I mean, I tend to be much more attracted to the Augustinian view of creation and the origin of evil. But even Augustine was still very much, I think, influenced by his own Manichaean history or Gnostic history and his own Platonic history. I think he represents a kind of compromise between these points of view. And so the creation of these technologies, the creation of technologies that are meant to capture the essence of the human body, that being either biological experiments or robots, or more and more capture the essence of the human mind, the human soul, the cognitive project of artificial intelligence, they represent just a deepening of that descent from what could be generically called ideas in the mind of God into the material. And then you have this kind of Black Mirror, to take a common trope, of these ideas in the technologies themselves. So it's both these technologies, I can see how in an inverted sense, a transhumanist or a posthumanist or effective accelerationist, whatever sort of technologically obsessive or techno-religious mentality you want to take, I think that by and large it represents an inversion of the big G Gnostic perspective. Because what you're talking about with the creation of these technologies is the imposition or the imprinting of the forms of the higher ideals into the material deeper and deeper and deeper, so that the soul is in some sense descending into the material. If you want to see that hierarchy in that fashion, which I by and large do, that it's the soul descending deeper and deeper into the material. And so that you end up with what, Rene Guénon would have called the sort of automated antichrist. Saying it does all the things Christ is supposed to do, right? These technologies have higher wisdom. These technologies have higher authority. These technologies are able to heal people. These technologies are able to bring people together and create goodness, right? But Christ, as I believe, is something far higher, something far beyond anything that we're looking at here in the material world, and certainly far beyond anything that you can manipulate with your mind and your hands. Whereas the technological project is this quest to deepen that immersion of the soul or consciousness into the material until you've created this bizarre, perhaps arguably soulless replica of the human mind, and then elevated it as the highest authority. So that was a long way of saying that, yeah, there's definitely Gnostics in Silicon Valley, but I would say that this is just being kind of a smart ass. I would say they are heretical Gnostics.
Yeah, I mean, what you just explained, this whole part of the technological, Terminator technocracy of transhumanism does, as you explained, go against some of the Gnostic principles. And so, it reminds me of my, if people aren't aware, I interviewed Mary Harrington on the podcast. They can check the archive. She talks about cyborg theocracy and meet Lego Gnosticism. But again, my worldview is Christian. And so I view Gnosticism as bad and evil in my mind. But again, it needs to be better applied. I'm sure there are listeners who are Gnostic and whatnot. No offense there, and I don't take offense to other people's worldviews. We believe what we believe. And so, I did have just a quick question on AI and whatnot, but just to sort of close, any other final thought then when it comes to this Gnosticism or New Age or Theosophy or whatnot?
mean, I think for the most part, yeah, it's crazy that the Lucis Trust is, an advisor to the UN, but they're like, in the council that they are advising, supposedly, there's 1,600 groups plus that are involved. I think the real question is like, as you're looking at all of this, like, what's the most and least relevant pieces of information? It's something that, I found in writing my book, especially and speaking to people like Max Moore and others, that there should be a real distinction, I think, between big tech and transhumanism. Just like there should be a real distinction between technocracy and transhumanism, and big tech and technocracy. It's not that there aren't overlaps, there are, but it's not as if they can all be lumped into the same category, because there are many transhumanists who are very anti-technocratic in the sense that they believe in a kind of liberatory or even Nietzschean point of view, that they're not particularly concerned with the masses. They just want to blast off into space and colonize the stars. And then there are those transhumanists who are very much in favor of a kind of technocratic reorganization of all society. And some of them are more right-wing and some of them are more left-wing. And in big tech, you can kind of see these ideas bubbling around. Some are more or less in one or the other camp. For instance, just a quick example, Jeff Bezos, I think, is a very humanistic sort of techno-obsessive individual, and very much a much more technocratic humanist, so that he's much more comfortable creating organizations of top-down algorithmic control. Whereas Elon Musk would be much more on the more Nietzschean, or maybe you could say Luciferian end of that. And Google is also very much obsessed with a sort of control structure and these vast, sprawling information networks with like tight controls on information. You could say, if we're going to like go out there with hyperbolic symbolism, if Google was God, then Elon Musk would be Lucifer. But in the sense that Google is the higher, and obviously hegemonic authority. And very close ties with the U.S. government and increasingly with the military, CIA, all of that. Musk as well, right? But Musk is much more, at least, cultivating a kind of public persona of independence and rebellion. And so yeah, if I could close out on anything, I could go on about this forever. I feel like I've only just gotten the engines running, but the isms are great training wheels, but the sooner we, at least those few, right, those few elect who are able to get past the training wheels of isms, I think that there is a much clearer view of the world just beyond. I myself am not claiming some special gnosis that gives me a greater perspective than all of the masses, but I will say with confidence that for myself, that the more I've been able to discard those hard and fast categorical isms, I think the clearer my perspective has been on the phenomena in front of us. And unfortunately, the less soundbite friendly it is, as any listener could probably surmise from the various rants that I've just gone on. But that's kind of the part of the deal. If I can appreciate anything about the kind of point of view put forward by the Gnostics, right? The Gnostics saw a kind of hierarchy of the pneumatics and the psychics and the hylics, right? Like from the most infused with gnosis to the least, or you had the same sort of hierarchy in Plato, in which you had in kind of parable form, the golden bloodline and the silver bloodline and the bronze bloodline, and this hierarchy of kind of intellectual capacity on down to the dull worker castes. Or in Hinduism, you've got the priest, the Brahmin caste, and then the Kshatriya, the warrior caste, and then the Vaishya, the artisan or merchant caste, and then the Shudra, the serfs, and then all that's outside, right, the untouchables. And while I think that those like crystallizations of human hierarchy are very damaging, especially in that there's not a whole lot of upward mobility as they're crystallized, I think that any honest observer knows that the old bell curve in regard to IQ is just a reality that we deal with, interpret it biologically, neurologically, or interpret it spiritually, or whatever overlap. It is just any school teacher who's honest with his or herself knows that there are some who are going to be able to actually capture kind of broad, more nuanced point of view, and those, as you move further and further onto the other side of the bell curve, who are going to be more prone towards simplistic isms. And I think that all of these types of people are necessary to make the world go round. You know, the Hindus, as much as they were condemned for their elitism, they still saw all four castes as in all the subcastes as being part of one body. That it takes all of these elements to move the society. And if you look at the eusocial insects, clearly a queen is useless by herself, and clearly the worker ants are doomed without a queen. And so, yeah, I know that this was supposed to be a tight closing statement, but I do think that, for those who have the capacity and the will to, kind of break out of the hard crystallizations and political platitudes, I encourage you to look with clear eyes at all of this, including the Gnostic texts. I think that if you are intellectually curious, you will find much that you will detest. You will find much that I think is quite interesting and perhaps even enlightening. But for those who are tied either on the high IQ spectrum, tied to whatever political platitudes that they have yoked their horse to, I would just ask you to stop being such fucking jackasses about it. And for those that are, on the other side of the spectrum, I wish you the best.
You remind me of a dinner I had with when I was in Acapulco, another attendee, and we were having tacos. We went to the conference, and then you just wander around town, see who you run into, and it's interesting because this guy, I guess, was a transhumanist, but almost like begrudgingly. The guy didn't understand. He didn't know who Klaus Schwab was. He comes to the Acapulco, right? He's not really hip to all this Great Reset stuff, but he knows something is off, and he just nonchalantly told me he believes in biohacking and transhumanism, and his buy-in is right. Just he wants to sort of like live forever. He doesn't believe in God, and it's not like necessarily these people are out to destroy and take over the world. I mean, that's just one example. Someone who just wants to live forever, so he's bought into that ideology. And so I do have to ask you about AI real quick. And I know you were on I don't even know this guy, but I learned about him because you tweeted that you were on his show, Shane Cashman, and this AI. Everyone's seen these clips now. These robot surgeons replacing heads on bodies, and I think he tweeted, I like what he said, head transplants are the real deep fakes of the future. And also Denis Rancourt, the Canadian scientist who's been a guest of mine, he just tweeted as well, slightly on a different topic, but still talking about AI. He says AI equals psyop. AI is a globalist psyop to get you to accept and celebrate the airtight electronic prison of control and surveillance that they are building at an accelerated pace. They need control and surveillance of domestic populations, not freedom, because they're ramping up economic and hot war, so on and so forth. Just so your sort of thoughts on this clip of AI robot surgeons, and now we're starting to hear that it's been a lot of hype, all this AI chat GPT stuff.
Yeah, if there's one thing that I've tried to emphasize, especially in the last year and a half, is that spectrum between hype, right? Any technology is going to be hyped by claiming it's everything. It's going to change everything. The entire world hinges on this technology. So for a long time, it was genetic engineering. Increasingly, that's AI or some blending between them, or robotics, all of it. This will change everything. And on the other side, the dismissive and skeptical, hyper-skeptical standpoint, it's nothing. It's literally just a toy. And then all of the different places between those two extreme poles. And then over here on the AI is everything pole, you have another spectrum that if AI is everything, it's going to be utopian, or it's going to mean the enslavement or demolition, or elimination of all of humanity, and then all the places in between. And that kind of carries over all the way across as well. So I think that the gentleman you just mentioned, I'm not familiar with him, but he kind of represents more on this AI is nothing and that it's just a psyop to control people. No, yeah, I wish. It's not necessarily, well, it's not what they are hyping it as, right? I don't believe that AI is God, big G, but I do think AI is sufficiently powerful to already kind of function as a God, little g. And I think that these systems are sufficiently sophisticated that, at least for going back to our bell curve, for the lower 50%, and many on the upper end, that these little g AI gods will be plenty appealing. They won't necessarily be seen as gods, but they will be these higher beings to whom you defer for authority, whose information is sought out as being in some way the bridge to realization. I mean, we already have that. We've had that with Google for over 2 decades now. This just simply adds a kind of personality layer to it. So yeah, to me, it's like this weird 1980s programmer boomer mentality. I'm not talking about the gentleman who just tweeted. I'm not attacking him, but there's this boomer kind of, old 80s and 90s programmer mentality. Oh, we've had that forever. You've had chatbot since the 60s. And it's like, yeah, dude, this ain't your granddaddy's chatbot. All right. Like, it's getting very, very different as time moves on. But it doesn't mean that it is living up completely to its hype, right? It's always going to be this approximation. You see something advertised and it comes and you're like, well, it's not exactly like the advertisement, but it's still, the gun still shoots or the pot still cooks, but it's not, it's not perfect like the advertisement. It's not nothing, right? It's not like an empty box came, but it's always going to be somewhere in between those two. I think the same too, by the way, as long as we, that video of the brain bridge, where you see the head being pulled off by robots and put onto the other body, and you see as it goes into it. I mean, it goes, what is it, like 8 minutes? It just gets increasingly ridiculous. These things are ripping the face off and like changing the face over. And then you think about the end result, this like weird Frankensteinian individual who has like this new body and a new face, but like the same scalp and ears. Like his ears are just going to get bigger and hairier. And the hair is going to start going, anyway, it's all quite ridiculous, I think, but symbolically it sets a tone so that the kind of the inner great replacement of failing human organs with mechanical parts becomes that much less shocking. Like if all of your triggers have been pulled by seeing, cartoons basically of heads transplanted onto another body, then the idea of putting a Neuralink in, or, maybe you're injecting young people's plasma, or maybe even eventually you start getting xenotransplants of pig hearts and pig lungs or monkey lungs or whatever. It becomes that much, it's less shocking. And that guy who created the concept video for Brainbridge, Hashim Al-Ghali, he's the same guy that back in 2022 did that concept video for the Ectolife pod babies. And Mary Harrington, actually, as far as I know, she coined pod babies, and it's great. But you've got these pod babies, these infants who are both genetically engineered, or at least genetically selected on a eugenic basis, which, by the way, that is being done now with in vitro fertilization of like multiple zygotes and then genetic testing and selection. That's happening right now. Sam Altman is investing in one of the companies, Genomic Prediction. But then, you get this like fantastic view of it. Like it just, pushes it out into the future. And now you've got like stadiums full of pod babies, and they're all genetically superior. They're all white. It's kind of interesting that was the choice. But anyway, the whole concept, even that you could gestate a human infant in a pod, a temperature controlled pod, just to any normal person, I think, at least one who hasn't been totally desensitized by science fiction or futurism, to any normal person, you're like, that sounds like shit. That sounds disgusting. That is awful. Like, you're going to literally create these weird, emotionless monsters who have no connection to their parents or their mothers in any meaningful way. But and you see it in the shocking form, though, and maybe it makes the idea of using surrogates for pregnancy, that much more normal. It's not like it's a pod baby. It's not like it's a bio bag. But on the other hand, I think that as far as all that goes, I don't know how long until we see the first human born from a bio bag. And, many in the little g Gnostic conspiracy crowd would say that, there are underground tunnels and hidden laboratories full of biobag babies run by artificial superintelligence using alien technology. It already understands all the universe and we're just literally imprisoned in its matrix. I mean, okay, fine. But barring that, the first time we'll see a public unveiling of a biobag baby, I don't think it's that far off. I mean, maybe, I don't know. A lot of it probably won't happen in a highly regulated place like America or Europe. But I can imagine if it hasn't happened already, it probably will in the near future, because you see like what they've done taking lambs, and I believe pigs is another popular, but lambs for sure. That's the ones that I've actually focused on, sheep. And they successfully raised up to a point, biobag lambs. And it's disgusting to look at. But then again, if you've witnessed a birth, that's also pretty disgusting to look at. So all this is to say, Havori, in my, as always, tangential and overlong, thank you very much for giving me all this space to be as long-winded as I naturally tend to be. On that spectrum between the hype, it is everything, and the hype, it is nothing. What I see happening, I don't think that human endeavors ever reach the crystalline perfection or even abject horror of total extermination and whatnot of the hype. But we are definitely moving closer and closer to that and farther away from it is nothing but a toy or it is nothing but a dream. And as that happens, I think that's what we're going to have to grapple with. It would be very easy if all of this was just nothing more than Eliza, right? If ChatGPT 4.0, right? If GPT 4.0 is just Eliza with a few extra bells and whistles, then you can just dismiss it. It's nothing, right? Then, I don't see how you could dismiss the surveillance systems if you're going to dismiss that. But anyway, then it's just nothing but a mirage. If, on the other hand, these are viable and increasingly sophisticated technologies, not only of control, but also of seduction, also in many ways of like greater longevity, of better understandings of material structures and social structures and all that, which I believe all of these are true. Then for those of a more traditionalist spiritual belief system in which God is the highest authority and our actions here on earth are much more, the import of our actions on earth are more due to our connection to and realization of the will of God than to any sort of material structure, then we have to confront that not only are they kind of piecemeal creating this strange global polytheistic system of AIs, these disembodied intelligences that are going to be given increasing authority. And these intelligences are going to at least be associated with, if not oftentimes embodying, robotic systems of increasing sophistication and precision, and also of biological manipulations of increasing sophistication and precision that do allow people to live longer and more painless lives. As Rene Guénon would say, as this sort of automated antichrist gains more and more power, we're going to have to reckon not only with that power, but also with the temptation to defer to it more so than to the rather obscure will of God that most of us don't necessarily have a direct line to. And that is the tension as I see it. I hope that was not too strange.
No, it's great. And I just wanted to comment in closing on your Substack, your singularity, not so weekly anymore, but one of your last posts, you talk about the threat is real, but so is your paranoia, conspiracy fatigue. And then you also tweeted out the blue pill sends you back into the matrix, but the real horror is realizing the red pill just sent you spiraling into an equally illusory, more paranoid matrix. We've kind of talked about that. You retweeted as well. I thought this was important. Without institutions, everything fractures into subgroups fighting each other for the proverbial clicks. Without underlying resources over time, people say, and do whatever allows them to survive. Fighting for actual political or cultural change rather than ratings becomes rare. And again, it's been really annoying. Yeah, I don't know if I mentioned this already in the interview. It's been a while, or we talked about this before, but I mentioned Ryan Christian just being the platform from Stripe, and then I shared my video, my interview with Edwin Black, who says, welcome to the algorithm ghetto, and someone in the comments says, isn't he a hardcore Zionist? It's like, so what? What Edwin Black says about algorithm ghetto is true. You can discard his Zionist aspect, and then it's just like, we need to be able to respect each other and talk with each other. And if you don't fit in my little Gnostic, conspiracist, definition, then you are controlled opposition. And so it's like, people need to really get a grip. I'm just tired of being aggressively attacked because, we'll have to have nuance. Some people have better conceptions of the truth on certain subjects than others. That doesn't mean they, take from each person. That's my whole shtick here, geopolitics and empire. And so, any closing thought, Joe?
Another one. All right. Closing thought number 3. It does make me think of one thing. I'm going to try to keep this one tight so that it's not so sprawling. But just speaking of that, pluralism and the ability to correspond with and cooperate with people who don't hold every single dogma that you do. There are some deal breakers for sure, right? I think abuse of children and animals might be a good start, right? Or the advocacy of total genocide. To me, call me a bleeding heart, but I feel like those are, at that point we're at an impasse. But by and large, people have a lot of common interests that go beyond the isms. Not to say the isms don't capture certain centers of gravity that do differentiate us, but there is a degree of pluralism in all human life, both within societies and between societies. And if there was one inspiration for me in religious studies, as I studied, this obsession with this became, really started when I was about 16. And began reading general textbooks and then began meeting as Hinduism and the religions of India in general. I don't think India is a perfect model for any civilization necessarily, right? Even in its more archaic forms that we can still fantasize about as opposed to the present realities. But there was something very, very interesting about India, especially before the British colonization. As various travelers, including like Chinese Buddhist travelers that were going back to the motherland of Buddhism to understand what India was, and also many of the colonial travelers, but also just the records of the kind of schools of thought that we do have, however murky they are. India was radically pluralistic. Of course, there were the kind of internal battles and different sects competed with each other. It appears the Hindus pushed the Buddhists out almost completely at the height of the early or first millennium Hindu dominance. But in general, India has found ways to kind of make room for all of these different ideas. You have 6 darshanas or schools or visions of what reality is. They're all mutually exclusive. They're all very different from each other. And yet they accept that each of those different darshanas or visions is at least has value, even if each person, whether you're Vedanta or Mimamsa or whatever, you believe that yours is the best, but you accept that others have value. And increasingly, Buddhism has become more acceptable in many ways to the Hindus. And Buddhism, I guess you could argue, is in some ways like the Gnostic turn of Hinduism. But yeah, I think that even, let's say you hate India. Well, in that case, if the Indians can get it right, surely we can. And if, let's say you love India and you kind of fetishize Hinduism in India like I do, then I think that India provides, in many ways, a very inspirational model for at least something like what could happen in the West. But I'm just a dreamer. I suspect, Havori, that I suspect that the future is going to be a lot more about factions and conflict. A lot of it kind of amplified and intensified by digital media and the silo culture of digital media. And I think that the more people are exposed to things that they hate, the more they will learn to hate each other. You know, in the ancient past, if you didn't encounter someone, or you might have heard a story, it didn't matter if you had Muslims across the ocean. It certainly didn't matter if you had Confucians across the ocean. But now, with this constant hyperconnectivity, every possible reason you have to hate somebody is in your face all the time. And I think that if I had to venture a guess, a prediction of the future, I think whatever pluralistic dream I may have will be very much overshadowed by the coming conflicts that will be amplified and exploited. But there's always cracks that the light shines in through. So, and that's what I'm looking at. I'm looking at the cracks, and I'm looking at the light, however obscure the image is.
Cracks, not crack. And that just makes me think. I had on recently Ambassador Stuart Eisenstadt, who's buddy with Joe Biden and Henry Kissinger and Victoria Nuland, and people got irritated with that. And I just feel like I'm practicing kind of a little bit what you're talking about. The image comes to my mind of St. Paul in the Agora, or the founding fathers who used to meet in the coffee lounges to sort of thresh all this stuff out. And that's kind of like what I'm doing on Geopolitics and Empire. It's like just I bring on people from all walks, and it's just like it's up to you, the listener, to discern what is right and wrong. Not necessarily for me to do it. So, sometimes I might lean towards a certain way, but it's just like I'm putting the onus on you with your thinking cap. You decide what you like, what you don't like, and toss the rest out. And so where you're on Substack, you're on X. I've got a copy of your book, Dark Aeon. Highly recommend it. If people haven't gotten a copy already, you're on Steve Bannon's WarRoom. Any other places or projects we should know about?
Okay, you called me out on Singularity Weekly. Unless something changes, you can expect that to actually be weekly, and you can also expect a few other additional elements there. That's what I've been spending a lot of time working on, but I don't want to announce anything quite yet for fear that it goes back to unweekly, but or just weekly, Singularity Weekly, WEAKLY. Yes, joebot.xyz. Keep your eye on it in the coming weeks. Maybe by the time this is released, you'll already start to see the stuff that I'm working on coming out. And if you found this entertaining, then maybe the more succinct and less verbose nuggets that I have for you will be fun.
I hope you enjoyed this Geopolitics and Empire podcast. The website is geopoliticsandempire.com, and I encourage you to sign up for the free email list that goes out with each podcast and every weekend with a collection of news headlines. The newsletter and website are our last lines of defense. We're being censored and deplatformed. It's nearly impossible to find Geopolitics and Empire on the Google search engine. We've been blacklisted. YouTube frequently takes down our videos with strikes. Facebook restricts our page. Reddit and Twitter take down posts. And after the Associated Press mentioned Geopolitics and Empire in a 2021 article co-written with NATO, our Patreon account was terminated. Vimeo also terminated our Pro account. The best free way to help Geopolitics and Empire is to leave a review on Apple Podcasts or elsewhere and subscribe to all of our media channels. You can find the video broadcast now on 5 platforms: Odyssey, Rockfin, Rumble, BitChute, and Brighteon. You can find the audio broadcast on the podcast ecosystem: SoundCloud, Apple, Spotify, and so on. My current favorite social media channels are Twitter and Telegram, but you can also find us on Gab, MeWe, Minds, Float, VK, Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Finally, Geopolitics and Empire is in dire need of funding to continue. You can leave a donation, purchase a consultation with the host, or become a member to receive additional benefits. We also produce a weekly broadcast called Dissident Thinker for members and Rockfin subscribers only. We will continue to fight the good fight come hell or high water. Thank you for listening.